Loud budgeting is supposed to save you money. Here's the part nobody's telling you. According to Bank of America's 2026 Better Money Habit Study, only 42% of Gen Z say they're actually comfortable turning down social plans they can't afford, and that number hasn't moved in a year. Meanwhile, separate research from Credit Karma found that 40% of Gen Z overspend specifically to keep pace with their friends, often going into debt to do it. Read those two numbers side by side. A huge share of this generation is talking about boundaries in public, and a huge share is still overspending in private to keep up. Those aren't two different groups. Survey data on the loud budgeting trend itself backs that up. Only about 1 in 5 Gen Z even recognize the term loud budgeting, and of that group, roughly a third say they actually practice it. That means the loud budgeting most people see going viral online is a small, visible minority, while the overspending to keep up behavior underneath it is happening at scale, mostly off camera. If you've ever wondered why you can't stick to a budget even after doing everything the internet told you to do, cutting the obvious stuff, saying no out loud, tracking the big expenses, this video is going to give you the actual answer, not another list of tips. It's going to show you something more specific and more useful, how a trend built to reduce social spending pressure can, for a lot of people, quietly relocate that pressure somewhere it's much harder to see, and what that's actually costing you. That's the real story behind the loud budgeting trend, and almost nobody who's covered it has connected these two datasets. We're going to the trend everyone's celebrating, and why that should worry you. Let's define the term properly, because most coverage of it doesn't. Loud budgeting is the practice of being openly, verbally honest about your financial limits in social situations, saying, "I can't, it's not in the budget," instead of inventing an excuse to skip an expensive dinner, a weekend trip, or a round of drinks. It was popularized in late 2023 by comedian Lucas Battle, who framed it as a direct rejection of quiet luxury, the older trend of spending enormous amounts of money to look like you hadn't spent anything at all. The pitch was simple and, on its face, genuinely healthy. Stop hiding your financial reality behind a fake excuse. Say the true thing. Normalize the word no. And by a lot of measures, it worked, at least for the people who genuinely adopted it. That same Bank of America research found 75% of Gen Z respondents said they're actively looking for ways to spend less in their social lives right now. Part of what made loud budgeting resonate so fast is that it directly attacked money shame, the old, quiet embarrassment around admitting you couldn't afford something. For a generation that grew up watching their parents get wrecked by 2008, then lived through a pandemic, then walked into the worst entry-level housing market in decades, replacing that shame with an open, almost proud kind of budget honesty was a genuinely mature cultural shift. So here's where I need to be precise about what this video is and isn't. This is not a takedown of loud budgeting as a concept, and it's not budget shaming anyone who practices it. If saying, "I can't afford that" out loud is helping you turn down a $90 dinner you didn't want to go to anyway, keep doing it. That's not the problem. Here's the problem. Loud budgeting, by design, only covers the spending that happens in front of other people. It works on the dinner invite, the weekend trip, the bachelorette party, the round of drinks, the visible social negotiated moments where you have to say something out loud to someone else. But the average person's financial leak isn't happening in those moments. It's happening in the $11 DoorDash order at 11 p.m. that nobody sees. It's happening in the subscription that renewed itself for the 4th month in a row. It's happening in the buy now, pay later checkout button that doesn't feel like debt because it's 4 payments of $19 instead of 1 payment of $76. None of that requires you to say anything out loud to anyone. None of it triggers the boundary-setting muscle loud budgeting is training you to use. So you can become genuinely, measurably better at the visible 20% of your spending, the part your friends can see, while the invisible 80%, the part that actually determines whether you have money at the end of the month, goes completely unaudited. That gap is exactly why so many people can't stick to a budget past the first few weeks, and it's what this entire video is built around. Not whether loud budgeting is good or bad. It's neither. It's incomplete. And incomplete financial systems don't fail loudly. They fail exactly the way this one does. Quietly in categories nobody's watching, while the person doing it feels correctly like they've been doing everything right. What loud budgeting actually is. And what the data says about who's really doing it. Before we go any further into the psychology, I want to make sure we're standing on solid ground about what loud budgeting actually is, because most coverage of this trend treats it like it's a mass movement. The data says something different, and that gap matters more than people realize. According to research from Clarify Capital, only about 1 in 5 Gen Z respondents even recognize the term loud budgeting when asked directly. Of that group, the ones who know what it is, roughly a third say they actually practice it. Run the math on that, and you land somewhere around 6% of Gen Z who identify as actual practicing loud budgeters. 6%. Not a generational shift. A visible, vocal minority. That number is the first thing that should reframe how you think about this trend, because it explains something that's been quietly confusing about it. If you scroll TikTok, loud budgeting looks enormous. It looks like the default financial posture of an entire generation. But visibility on a platform and prevalence in a population are two completely different things, and this is one of the clearest examples of that gap I've seen in the Gen Z overspending statistics I've looked at. The same research found that search interest in the term spiked over 1,600% internationally in a single month. That's the algorithm amplifying a real but small behavior into something that reads as universal. A relatively small number of people are being loud about loud budgeting, and the volume of that noise is what's creating the impression of a movement. Now, here's what's genuinely interesting. For the people actually doing it, it's working. That same data set found loud budgeters save an average of $629 a month, specifically attributable to the practice. Turning down the dinner, skipping the trip, saying the boundary out loud instead of finding an excuse. That's not a trivial number. Over a year, that's over $7,500 in avoided spending for the group that's actually applying the behavior consistently, not just posting about it. So we have two things that are both true at once, and holding them together is the whole point of this chapter. 1. Loud budgeting, practiced genuinely, produces real, measurable savings for the small group actually doing it. 2. The visible cultural footprint of the trend, the volume of people talking about it, referencing it, using the language of it, is dramatically larger than the group actually living it. And underneath both of those facts sit the broader Gen Z overspending statistics that almost never get mentioned in the same breath as loud budgeting, the ones showing how much overspending is still happening in parallel, in categories this trend was never built to touch. That second point is where I want you to sit for a second, because it's the seam this whole video is going to work through. Language spreads faster than behavior. This isn't unique to loud budgeting. It's how trends work generally, from clean eating to quiet quitting. The vocabulary of a movement is cheap to adopt. You can say, "I can't, it's not in the budget," in a group chat in about 2 seconds. Actually restructuring your relationship to social spending, building the discipline to hold that boundary under real pressure, auditing your finances honestly enough to know what you can and can't afford, that's slow, effortful, and largely invisible. So what tends to happen, and what the data here is quietly showing us, is that a lot of people adopt the language of loud budgeting as a kind of social armor, a phrase that signals financial self-awareness, without necessarily doing the underlying work the phrase was originally built to represent. That's not a criticism. It's just how trends propagate, and it's worth naming clearly before we go further, because it sets up the exact question this video is built to answer. If only 6% are practicing this fully, and the language is spreading 10 times faster than the behavior, what does everyone else's relationship to spending actually look like underneath the phrase? Are they simply behind on adopting a good habit? Or is something else happening, something the loud budgeting language might actually be obscuring rather than fixing? We're going to give the trend its full due first, because it deserves it. Then we're going to answer that question directly. The case for loud budgeting. Steelmaning the trend. I want to stop and give this trend its full credit, because everything that comes later in this video only means something if you understand that loud budgeting is not a scam, not a gimmick, and not a symptom of financial illiteracy. In several concrete ways, it's one of the healthier money behaviors to come out of internet culture in years. If I skip this chapter, the rest of the video reads as a takedown. It's not. So, let's build the actual case. First, it attacks the single most expensive financial habit most people have: silence. For decades, the dominant cultural script around money was to never discuss it. Not your salary, not your debt, not why you're declining an invitation. That silence had a cost, and the cost was that people would rather overspend than say a true, slightly uncomfortable sentence out loud. Bank of America's 2026 Better Money Habits research found that 75% of Gen Z are actively looking for ways to spend less in their social lives specifically, not overall, but in the exact social context where silence used to force people into spending they didn't want to do. Loud budgeting gives people a script for that moment. "I can't, it's not in the budget" is a complete sentence that ends the negotiation. It doesn't require justifying yourself, inventing a fake conflict, or feeling guilty for having a financial limit. That's not a small thing psychologically. It's removing friction from the single moment where most discretionary overspending actually happens. The ask from another person live in real time with social pressure attached. Second, for the people who genuinely practice it, the savings are real and specific, not vague. We already covered the number, $629 a month on average for practicing loud budgeters, according to Clarify Capital's research. That's not a rounding error improvement. That's a number that, compounded over even a few years in a basic high-yield account, changes what someone's 20s actually look like financially. This isn't a trend that produces feel-good sentiment with no financial substance behind it. For the group actually doing it, it's converting into real dollars sitting in real accounts. Third, and this is the part most criticism of the trend misses entirely, it's connected to a broader, genuinely positive shift in how this generation relates to money culturally. The same research shows nearly 60% of Gen Z now prefer buying pre-owned goods, particularly in categories like clothing and luxury items, specifically to avoid the depreciation and status chasing that defined earlier eras of consumer spending. Separate Harris polling found 63% of Gen Z have bought clothing secondhand, compared to 47% of the general population. Loud budgeting isn't happening in isolation. It's one visible expression of a wider move away from performative spending altogether. The generation that popularized loud budgeting is the same one driving thrift culture, driving skepticism toward influencer marketing, driving the de-influencing trend that pushes back on unnecessary purchases in the first place. Taken together, these aren't disconnected internet fads. They're symptoms of a generation that watched the 2008 crash as children, walked into a historically unaffordable housing market as adults, and responded by building a culture that treats financial honesty as socially acceptable instead of embarrassing. And fourth, it has a measurable community effect. Loud budgeting isn't just an individual behavior. Bank of America's researchers specifically noted that when people talk openly about financial boundaries, it tends to normalize that behavior for the people around them. Saying, "I can't afford that," out loud doesn't just protect your own wallet in that moment. It quietly gives the next person in the group permission to say the same thing without feeling like the odd one out. That's a genuine positive externality, a trend that gets stronger and more effective specifically because it's public rather than private. So hold all of that. Boundary setting that actually works in the moment it's needed. Real, specific savings for the people practicing it. A connection to a broader and healthier relationship with consumer spending. A community effect that reinforces itself. On every one of those dimensions, loud budgeting earns its reputation. Which is exactly why the question I'm about to ask is going to feel uncomfortable. Because it's not a question about whether loud budgeting works. It clearly does, for the visible 20% of spending it was built to cover. The question is what's happening in the 80% it was never designed to touch, and whether the confidence people are building in the visible category is quietly making them less careful in the invisible one. The question no one's asking? Here's the question. If someone has spent the last 6 months telling their friends, "I can't, it's not in the budget," turning down dinners, skipping trips, holding that boundary in front of other people, out loud, repeatedly, what happens to the part of them that still wants those things? Because wanting doesn't disappear just because you've built a socially acceptable way to say no to it. And this is the piece almost nobody covering loud budgeting has been willing to sit with. The trend didn't eliminate the underlying financial FOMO Gen Z has been dealing with for years. It gave people a script for managing it in public. What it didn't do, what it was never designed to do, is address where that same pressure goes once it's been successfully deflected in a social moment. Let's look at what we actually know about that underlying pressure, independent of loud budgeting entirely. Research from Credit Karma found that 40% of people, specifically Gen Z, overspend in certain situations, and end up in debt specifically to keep pace with their peers. Separate research puts the number even higher for the broader FOMO effect. Roughly 69% of millennials and Gen Z say they experience FOMO regularly, and that same 69% admit to overspending specifically to avoid that feeling. A study from Merge focused on live events found that 85.8% of Gen Z respondents exceeded their budget when attending concerts, festivals, or sporting events, driven, in their own words, by the atmosphere, the emotional pull of the moment, and peer influence. Now here's the part that matters. None of that data contradicts loud budgeting. It coexists with it. A person can be a genuinely committed loud budgeter, turning down the casual Thursday dinner, saying no to the impulse weekend trip, and still be part of that 85.8% who blows their budget the moment they're standing at a concert with 3 friends who are all buying merch. Those aren't opposite behaviors from opposite types of people. Based on what we know about how financial identity works, they're frequently the same person, in 2 different contexts. This is where I want to introduce the actual mechanism, because FOMO as a word gets thrown around so loosely that it's lost most of its explanatory power. What's really happening is closer to something researchers call psychological compensation. When a person restricts themselves in one domain, especially publicly and effortfully, it can create pressure to make up for it in another domain, particularly one where the restriction isn't being watched or measured. This isn't a character flaw. It's a well-documented pattern across behavioral research generally, not unique to money. You see it in dieting, where public restriction in one meal predicts private overconsumption in another. You see it in productivity, where a person who publicly commits to a strict work schedule often reports higher off-hours impulsivity. The mechanism is the same. Visible, socially reinforced discipline in one area quietly raises the psychological cost of restricting yourself everywhere else, because you've already spent your discipline budget where people could see it. Apply that directly to loud budgeting, and the shape of the problem becomes obvious. The entire trend operates in the visible zone, the moments where another person is present, watching, waiting for an answer. That's exactly where the discipline gets performed, reinforced, and rewarded with social approval. But the compensation, if it happens, doesn't need an audience. It happens later, alone on a phone, at 11 p.m., in a category nobody's tracking and nobody's going to ask you about at brunch. Nobody has ever said, "I can't, it's not in the budget," to a DoorDash app. You don't owe an algorithm an explanation. So the exact discipline that gets trained and rewarded in social settings has no equivalent mechanism in the categories where a huge share of actual monthly spending happens. This is also, I'd argue, where quiet luxury versus loud budgeting as a cultural framing quietly misleads people. It sets up spending as a binary. Either you're performing wealth quietly, or you're performing restraint loudly, as if the whole problem is which persona you're broadcasting. But performative frugality is still performative. It's still organized around what other people see. And a financial system built entirely around what's visible to an audience was never going to catch the spending that happens specifically, because no audience is present. So here's the actual claim, stated as clearly as I can state it. Loud budgeting doesn't create financial discipline. It creates social discipline in social contexts. Genuine financial discipline has to hold in the categories nobody's watching, and that's precisely the terrain this trend was never built to cover. The next question is why that gap exists specifically in the categories it does, and that's a matter of psychology, not willpower. The psychology of self-signaling, why public frugality has a price. To understand why this gap exists specifically where it does, we need one concept from social psychology, and I want to walk through it carefully because it's the engine behind everything else in this video: self-signaling. Most people are familiar with the idea of signaling to other people. You wear a certain brand, you post a certain photo, you say a certain sentence in a group chat, and it communicates something about you to your audience. Loud budgeting is an obvious example of that. Saying, "I can't, it's not in the budget," signals financial maturity to the people around you. But self-signaling is different, and it's the part almost nobody talks about. Self-signaling is when an action communicates something to yourself. You use your own behavior as evidence for who you are, the same way you'd use someone else's behavior as evidence for who they are. Here's why that distinction matters so much for money, specifically. When you turn down a dinner invite and say the loud budgeting line out loud, two things happen at once. You signal discipline to your friends, and you also generate a small piece of internal evidence that reads, "I am someone who has their finances under control." That evidence gets filed away and it accumulates. Do it enough times, in front of enough people, and you build what feels like a settled identity. Financially responsible person. Not trying to be. Is. That identity is genuinely valuable, right up until it runs into a well-documented finding from behavioral economics called moral licensing, sometimes called the halo effect in spending research. The mechanism is simple. Once someone has established evidence that they're a good version of themselves in one domain, they unconsciously grant themselves permission to relax in an adjacent domain because the identity feels secure enough to absorb it. It's the same reason someone who goes for a run in the morning is statistically more likely to order dessert that night. They've already banked the identity of someone who takes care of their health, so the dessert doesn't feel like it threatens that identity. It feels like a reward the identity has earned. Apply that directly to loud budgeting, and you can see the exact mechanism at work. Someone turns down 3 social invitations in a week, says the line each time, and by Thursday night they've built up a substantial amount of internal evidence. I am disciplined with money. That identity is now secure enough that when the DoorDash notification hits at 11 p.m., your usual order is 1 tap away. There's no friction left to stop it. Not because the person is being hypocritical, and not because the earlier discipline was fake. Because the identity work is already done. The $11 doesn't feel like it threatens financially responsible person, because that identity was just proven, publicly, 3 times this week. The purchase gets absorbed into an identity that already has room for it. This is the piece that makes the whole pattern so hard to catch from the inside. It doesn't feel like backsliding. It feels earned. And that's precisely why it's so much more dangerous than ordinary overspending. Ordinary overspending usually comes with a flicker of guilt because there's no story that makes it okay. Compensatory spending after visible discipline comes with the opposite feeling, a quiet sense of permission. I've been so good about this. I deserve this. That sentence isn't a rationalization bolted on after the fact. It's the self-signaling mechanism doing exactly what it evolved to do, in real time before the purchase even happens. And this is where I think a lot of people watching this video are going to recognize something they've felt but never had language for. It's not that you don't understand money. It's not that your discipline is fake. It's that the discipline you're building is real and specific, and it's being built entirely in the one place, social, visible, in front of other people, where it can't actually protect the rest of your finances. The identity is genuine. It's just incomplete. And an incomplete identity doesn't feel incomplete from the inside. It feels finished because every piece of evidence you've collected for it has been positive. This also explains something that might have seemed contradictory. How someone can be a committed, genuine loud budgeter and still be part of the 85.8% who blows their budget at a concert. It's not contradictory at all once you see the mechanism. The concert is exactly the kind of moment where accumulated self-evidence of discipline provides the most psychological cover for spending. You've earned it, you're already the responsible one in the group. One night won't undo that identity. The stronger someone's loud budgeting identity, in some cases, the more psychological room it can create for exactly this kind of release valve. The FOMO data nobody's connecting to this trend. Let's take this mechanism and hold it up against the actual research on financial FOMO, because once you see the numbers laid out together, the connection to loud budgeting becomes hard to unsee. Start with the baseline. Multiple independent studies converge on a similar figure. Roughly 69% of millennials and Gen Z say they experience FOMO regularly, and that same group, 69%, admits to overspending specifically to avoid that feeling. That's not 2 separate statistics that happen to share a number. It's the same population, reporting both the emotional trigger and the financial behavior it produces at matching rates. Credit Karma's research narrows that further and puts a harder edge on it. 40% of Gen Z specifically say they overspend, in some cases going into debt, in order to keep pace with their peers. Now look at where that FOMO actually gets triggered, because this is the detail most coverage skips entirely. Research on FOMO-specific drivers found that the biggest triggers are seeing posts about travel at 59%, followed by parties and social events at 56%, and food at 29%. Read that list again with loud budgeting in mind. Every one of those categories, travel, parties, food, is exactly the terrain loud budgeting was built to cover. It's the dinner invite, the trip, the night out. Which means the trend is aimed with real precision at the primary triggers of financial FOMO. That's not a coincidence, and it's part of why loud budgeting resonated as hard as it did. It's targeting the right battlefield. But precision on the primary triggers doesn't mean coverage of all of them. The Merge research on live events found that 85.8% of Gen Z respondents exceeded their budget specifically at concerts, festivals, and sporting events. And when researchers asked why, the answers weren't about lacking a boundary-setting phrase. They pointed to the atmosphere, the emotional connection to the moment, and peer influence operating in real time, inside the event, not at the planning stage where a loud budgeting line could be deployed. You can say, "I can't, it's not in the budget," when a friend texts you about a concert 3 weeks out. It's a lot harder to say it standing at the merch table with a friend already standing next to you, credit card out, the moment already happening. This is the structural gap. Loud budgeting is a decision point tool. It works when there's a clear moment to say yes or no out loud to another person in advance. But a huge share of the spending the FOMO data describes doesn't happen at a decision point. It happens in the moment, ambient, unplanned. Standing at a merch table, scrolling past a story of a friend's vacation at 11 p.m., seeing a group chat photo from a dinner you skipped. There's no negotiation to decline in those moments. No one asked you a question you can answer with a boundary. The spending isn't a response to a request, it's a response to a feeling, and "I can't, it's not in the budget" is a sentence built for requests, not feelings. That's the piece that connects directly back to the self-signaling mechanism. The FOMO doesn't go away just because someone's gotten good at declining invitations. The research is clear that the underlying feeling is present in roughly 7 out of 10 young adults, consistently, regardless of how disciplined they are in social settings. What loud budgeting changes is when and how that FOMO gets expressed. It gets successfully redirected away from the visible, negotiated moments, and the accumulated evidence of that success is precisely what builds the identity that makes the ambient, unplanned spending feel earned rather than reckless. It's worth being precise here about a term you've probably already seen online. This ambient, feeling-driven spending is closely related to what's now called doom spending, though the two aren't identical. Doom spending is specifically anxiety-driven, a reaction to stress rather than to social comparison. What we're describing here is, more specifically, FOMO-driven. They overlap constantly in real life, and we're going to unpack doom spending on its own terms, mechanism, and all in the next video. For now, the point is simpler. Whatever you call it, it's not something a boundary-setting phrase was ever built to catch. So the FOMO data and the loud budgeting data aren't describing two different groups of people. They're describing the same 69%, filtered through two different kinds of spending moments, one where a phrase can intervene, and one where it can't. And the second category, the ambient one, is exactly where we're headed next, the specific spending categories where this pattern actually lives, and why almost none of them get audited the way a dinner invite does. The compensation categories, where the leak actually happens. Let's get specific, because the last 3 chapters have been building toward one practical question. If the compensation isn't happening in the categories loud budgeting covers, where is it actually happening? There are 4 categories that show up again and again in how this pattern plays out, and what they have in common isn't the dollar amount. It's that none of them ever require you to say a sentence out loud to another person. The first category is delivery and convenience spending. This is the DoorDash order, the Uber Eats notification, the "your usual is one tap away" prompt. Structurally, this is close to the perfect compensation purchase because it's been engineered, genuinely by design, to remove every piece of friction a loud budgeting boundary would need to activate. There's no other person to say no to. There's no invitation to decline. It's you, a phone, and an app that has your saved payment method, your order history, and a one-tap checkout built specifically to close the gap between impulse and purchase before any reflection happens. You can hold a boundary against a friend asking you to dinner. It's a fundamentally different psychological task to hold a boundary against an interface built by product teams whose entire job is to make that boundary as easy as possible to skip. The second category is subscriptions. This one is worth sitting with, because it doesn't even require a decision most months. It requires the absence of one. A subscription doesn't ask you, can I have $14.99 this month? It simply renews silently, unless you actively go looking for it to stop it. That's the opposite structure of loud budgeting, which is built entirely around active, verbal, in-the-moment refusal. Subscriptions are designed to never present that moment at all. This is why subscription audits consistently turn up services people forgot they had, not because those people are careless, but because the entire category is engineered around the absence of a decision point, and loud budgeting only has power at decision points. The third category is what I'll call treat culture purchases: the coffee, the skincare item, the small clothing purchase that gets framed explicitly as a reward. This category is the most directly connected to the self-signaling mechanism because the justification is often built right into the purchase itself. It's not spending, it's self-care. It's not overspending, it's something earned after a hard week or after a stretch of genuine discipline elsewhere. Trend researchers have documented this exact language pattern showing up alongside financial slang terms like girl math, small purchases getting mentally reclassified as free, justified, or not really spending because they're framed as compensation for good behavior elsewhere. That framing isn't accidental, and it isn't unique to any one person's willpower. It's the identity protection mechanism, expressed as a sentence you say to yourself instead of a sentence you say to a friend. The fourth category is buy now, pay later. This one deserves the most attention because it's structurally different from the other three. It doesn't just avoid the loud budgeting decision point, it actively disguises the size of the purchase that would normally trigger one. A $76 purchase might genuinely prompt someone to think twice, maybe even say a version of the loud budgeting line to themselves. Split into 4 payments of $19, that same $76 purchase crosses a completely different psychological threshold. It's been restructured, deliberately, by the platforms offering it, to fall below the size of expense that usually activates financial caution, while the total obligation is identical. BNPL adoption has grown fastest specifically among younger consumers, in significant part because it lets someone maintain the feeling of financial discipline. I'm not putting this on a credit card. I'm not going into debt, while taking on an obligation that behaves exactly like debt in every way that matters, except the one that would normally trigger a boundary. Look at what these 4 categories share. None of them involve another person asking you a direct question. None of them happen at a clear, in-advance decision point the way a dinner invitation does. And every one of them has been either designed or culturally reframed specifically to minimize the friction that would normally trigger financial caution. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really about willpower either. It's that an entire generation of products and financial tools has been built with real design intent to operate in exactly the terrain loud budgeting doesn't reach. The trend gave people a powerful tool for the visible 20% of their financial life. It said nothing about the 80% that was, separately and simultaneously, being engineered to bypass exactly that kind of tool. Why this isn't hypocrisy? It's human nature? I want to pause here and say something plainly, because everything in the last 4 chapters could easily be misread as an accusation, and that's not what it is. If you watched those chapters and felt a flicker of recognition, if you thought of a specific DoorDash order, a specific subscription, a specific BNPL checkout, that recognition is not evidence that you're bad with money. It's evidence that you're a normal human being with a normal, well-documented psychological architecture, operating inside financial products that were built by very smart people whose specific job was to route around exactly the kind of discipline you were building. Here's why that distinction matters. And it's not a semantic one. If this were a willpower problem, the fix would be try harder, be more disciplined, feel more guilt, white-knuckle your way through the next DoorDash notification. That's the advice most financial content defaults to, and it's part of why so much of it doesn't work. It's aiming at the wrong target. Moral licensing isn't a character flaw you can grit your teeth through. It's a documented pattern that shows up across completely unrelated domains: dieting, exercise, environmental behavior, even ethical decision-making in workplace studies. People who've done something virtuous in one visible area consistently, measurably, give themselves more room in an adjacent area. This isn't a Gen Z problem, and it isn't a money problem specifically. It's a feature of how human identity and self-perception work, and it shows up in money because money happens to be one of the places where the visible and invisible categories are easiest to structurally separate. And the second half of the problem, the design half, isn't something willpower was ever going to solve because it wasn't built to be noticed in the first place. A one-tap checkout isn't a moral failing on the part of the person using it. It's the output of enormous amounts of product research specifically optimized to reduce the number of decision points between impulse and purchase. Buy now, pay later isn't tempting you because you're weak. It's engineered deliberately to fall under the psychological threshold where caution usually activates. You are not failing to notice something that was easy to notice. You are failing to notice something that a great deal of money and expertise was spent making difficult to notice. That's a completely different situation than a lack of discipline, and it deserves a completely different response. So here's the honest version of what's happening, without the shame that usually gets attached to it. You built genuine discipline in the one place this trend gave you a tool for the visible, social, negotiated moments. That discipline is real. It's not undone by the fact that a different part of your spending, operating by a different mechanism, in categories specifically designed to avoid triggering that same discipline, has been quietly moving in the opposite direction. Those two things aren't in contradiction. They're two separate systems, and only one of them has had a tool built for it so far. That reframe matters because it changes what the fix actually looks like. If this were a hypocrisy problem, the fix would be feeling worse about yourself until you stop. If it's a visibility problem, and the evidence says it is, the fix is building the same kind of clarity in the invisible categories that loud budgeting already built in the visible ones. Not more guilt. More light in the right places. Before we get to what that actually looks like, I want to show you what this pattern costs in real numbers, because right now everything we've covered has been mechanism, and mechanism without a dollar figure attached tends to stay abstract. It shouldn't stay abstract. Let's make it concrete. The real number. What this pattern costs over a year. I want to be precise about what I'm about to show you, because precision is the whole point of this channel. This is not a statistic from a study claiming to have measured exactly how much the average person spends in these four categories. Nobody has run that specific study, and I'm not going to pretend one exists. What I'm going to do instead is build a transparent, bottom-up estimate using realistic, commonly cited figures for each category so you can see exactly how the number gets built, and more usefully, so you can immediately swap in your own numbers and run this same math on your own spending. Delivery and convenience spending. A single delivery order, food delivery, a rideshare, a quick convenience app purchase, commonly run somewhere in the $15 to $25 range once fees and tips are included. If that happens even twice a week, which is a conservative, unremarkable frequency for someone who considers themselves a light user, that's roughly $40 a week. Over a year, that's a little over $2,000. Subscriptions. The average person underestimates their own subscription load by a wide margin. Audits of personal subscription spending routinely turn up 2 to 3 times more active subscriptions than the person believed they had, because the category is specifically designed around the absence of a renewal decision. A modest, realistic subscription stack, a couple of streaming services, a fitness or wellness app, a cloud storage tier, maybe a forgotten trial that converted to paid, commonly lands between $50 and $80 a month. At $65 a month, that's $780 a year, much of it for services that see minimal or no actual use. Treat culture purchases. This is deliberately the hardest category to pin down because it's the one people track least. By definition, these are the purchases framed as too small or too justified to count. A conservative estimate, 2 to 3 small, self-justified purchases a week, a coffee upgrade, a skincare item, a small clothing piece, in the $8 to $15 range. At roughly $12 per purchase, twice a week, that's about $1,250 a year. Buy now, pay later. This is the category with the widest range, because BNPL obligations vary enormously by how many active plans someone is running at once. A single moderate BNPL habit, say, 3 to 4 active installment plans across a year, averaging $200 each in total purchase value, adds up to $600 to $800 a year in principal alone, before accounting for the missed payment fees that BNPL providers rely on for a meaningful share of their revenue. Add those 4 categories together, Using these conservative, middle-of-the-road assumptions, and you land somewhere around $4,800 to $5,000 a year, moving through a person's account in amounts small enough that almost none of it ever gets audited, because none of it ever crossed the threshold that triggers scrutiny. Now put that number next to the earlier one. The average genuine loud budgeter, according to Clarify Capital's research, saves $629 a month, about $7,500 a year, by holding the line in the visible category. If a portion of that same discipline is quietly being offset by $4,800 to $5,000 a year leaking out through the four invisible categories, the net benefit of loud budgeting for that person isn't $7,500. It could be closer to $2,500 to $2,700, still positive, still worth doing, but a fraction of what the visible numbers alone suggest. I want to be direct about the limits of this estimate, because that's part of being trustworthy with you. This isn't a claim that every loud budgeter loses exactly this much. It's a model, built from realistic category-level numbers, that shows you where to look and how the math works. Your actual number could be smaller. For a lot of people watching this, it's probably larger. That's not a flaw in the exercise. It's the entire point of it. If you want to see how your own numbers compare to the broader Gen Z overspending statistics, the number that matters isn't the one I just gave you. It's the one you're about to go calculate for yourself, using your own bank statement instead of my assumptions. How to get the benefits of loud budgeting without the blind spot. Everything up to this point has been diagnosis. This is the fix, and I want to give you something you can actually use today, not a vague suggestion to be more mindful. The whole thesis of this video is that loud budgeting works because it creates a visible decision point in front of another person. So the fix isn't to abandon loud budgeting. It's to build the equivalent of that decision point in the four categories that don't naturally have one. Step 1. Run the audit on your actual accounts, not my estimates. Open your bank and card statements from the last 30 days and manually tag every transaction into one of the four categories: delivery and convenience, subscriptions, treat culture purchases, BNPL installments. This takes about 15 minutes, and I want to be specific about why it has to be manual at least this first time. Budgeting apps that auto-categorize spending are convenient, but convenience is exactly the property that let these categories become invisible in the first place. The friction of doing it by hand, actually reading each line, actually writing down what it was, is the same friction loud budgeting introduces when you say a boundary out loud. It's not a coincidence that the fix mirrors the mechanism. Visibility is the entire intervention. Step 2. For subscriptions specifically, apply what I'd call the reinvitation test. Loud budgeting works because it forces an active yes or no in front of someone else. Subscriptions avoid that by design, so you have to manufacture the moment yourself. For every active subscription, ask one direct question. If this service texted me right now and asked, "Can I charge you again this month?" would I say yes out loud? Not, "Would I probably keep using it eventually?" Would you say yes today if asked directly? If the honest answer is no or "I'm not sure," that's your loud budgeting boundary. You just have to trigger it manually because the product was built specifically so you'd never have to answer that question. Step 3. For delivery and treat culture spending, install what behavioral researchers call a friction point, deliberately on purpose, since the product removed the natural one. This can be as simple as a 24-hour rule for any non-essential purchase under the threshold that would normally trigger caution, or as concrete as removing saved payment methods from delivery apps so that every order requires manually re-entering a card number. That sounds small. It isn't. These categories were engineered specifically to eliminate exactly this kind of friction, so reintroducing even 60 seconds of it restores a meaningful amount of the natural pause that a loud budgeting boundary provides in social settings. Step 4. Treat BNPL as what it structurally is, not what it's marketed as. Before accepting a buy now, pay later split at checkout, do the math. Multiply the installment by the total number of payments, out loud if you have to, the same way you'd say a loud budgeting line to a friend. That's not 4 payments of $19. That's $76. The entire psychological trick of BNPL is that it prevents you from ever hearing the full number spoken. Saying it yourself, even silently, restores the decision point the product was designed to remove. Step 5, and this is the one that ties everything back together. Extend the actual language of loud budgeting into these categories, even without an audience. Part of why loud budgeting works isn't just the boundary, it's the verbal commitment. Saying something out loud, even to yourself, activates a different part of decision-making than silently clicking a button. So literally say it. I can't. It's not in the budget before the DoorDash order goes through. It will feel strange because there's no one there to hear it. That's exactly the point. The mechanism was never really about the audience. It was about converting a silent, frictionless impulse into a spoken, examined decision. You don't need someone else in the room for that to work. You just have to actually do it out loud every time. The deeper pattern this is actually part of. Step back from the 4 categories for a second, because I don't want you to leave this video thinking the lesson is audit your DoorDash spending. That's true, but it's the smallest true thing here. The actual pattern is this. Any financial discipline that only operates where other people can see it will always have a corresponding blind spot exactly where they can't. Loud budgeting is one specific version of that pattern, but it's not the only one, and it's probably not even the biggest one. The same mechanism explains why someone can be genuinely rigorous about a morning routine and fall apart every night. It explains why a strict weekday budget so often has a weekend that doesn't resemble it at all. Visible discipline and invisible compensation aren't two unrelated behaviors. They're two ends of the same rope, and most people have only ever been taught to watch one end of it. That's the real reason this video exists. Not to tell you loud budgeting is broken, it isn't, but to show you that any single tool, no matter how good, only covers the terrain it was built for. And there's one specific pattern sitting directly behind almost everything we've covered today, the mechanism that explains why the invisible categories get filled in the first place, not just where. It has a name Gen Z coined without fully realizing how accurately, or how dangerously, it describes what's actually happening. Here's what's actually true once you strip away the framing. Loud budgeting isn't the problem, and it was never the lie. The lie was believing that discipline you build in front of an audience automatically travels to the moments when no one's watching. It doesn't. It has to be built there, separately, on purpose. The same visibility, just pointed somewhere new. So here's what to do with that before Monday. Pull up your last 30 days. 15 minutes for categories, no app doing it for you. Not to feel bad about what you find. To finally see it. That's the whole intervention. Not guilt. Light. You didn't fail at this. You were handed a tool built for one room in the house and never told the others existed. Now you know they're there. But there's a deeper question underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually explains why those invisible categories get filled in the first place. Not just where the money goes, but what's driving the hand that spends it. It has a name now. Gen Z calls it doom spending, and almost nobody who uses that term understands the mechanism behind it. That's next.